Oh, I thought I was gonna die. Legitimately, it was disgusting. Welcome back to the Spectral Frame. Today, we're talking about my most anticipated movie from 2024, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. Scared my cat.
Come to me. Hear my call. He's coming.
Who is coming to you, my child? Nosferatu.
Nosferatu tells the gothic folk tale of a young woman supernaturally connected to a vampire. To get closer to her, the vampire, Count Orlok, decides to move himself, his coffin, and his best friends, all of them rats, overseas to live in her neighborhood. He just wants to hook up. It's weird and clingy, yes, but I'm not here to judge.
There is a devil in this world, and I have met him.
But you could never please me as he could.
I've been waiting all year to see this movie, and folk horror master Robert Eggers delivers. I really liked this movie. I'm a huge fan of Robert Eggers' work. The Lighthouse is probably one of my favorite movies, subtle insight into how my brain works, and this is right up there in the pantheon of his work. But that's not to say everybody was super stoked on this movie. I saw Nosferatu with my girlfriend and a bunch of friends, and not only was our friend group divided on how they felt about this thing, our theater was divided on how they felt. Throughout the entire runtime of the movie, there's like kind of random laughs or scoffs and things like that. But at the end, when the credits rolled, there's a lot of clapping. Like, I was actually surprised. This wasn't like any special screening. It was just a random AMC and lots of clapping. Honestly, thinking about it, I can see why an audience might be divided on this thing. If you were expecting like a vampire movie with lots of blood and kills and bats and things like that, you're not getting it here. This is more of a atmospheric art piece than maybe some people were expecting, but I think it does its job fantastically. This is going to be a spoiler-free review since the movie just came out, but without any further ado, let's get into my likes. The first thing I loved about this movie, it's gorgeous. This is a beautiful film from the direction, cinematography, lighting, production design, costuming. No one can deny this is a gorgeous film. As a friend of mine said after the movie, this thing could hang up in a museum, and I agree with that. Robert Eggers had such a firm grasp on this material that nothing felt compromised or second-guessed throughout the entire runtime of this movie. And it's a 2-hour plus movie. Not much longer, like 2:12, I think, maybe? Anyway, he knows what he's doing.
Its desire is to consume all life on Earth.
Speaking of production design, the world is incredibly immersive. Like, I feel there and I feel of the time. A lot of the design includes a lot of worn, older things, but not in like that phony, like restoration hardware pottery barn kind of way where things are kind of like faux worn. This feels disgusting and dirty, and I loved it. My issue with a lot of movies that deal with this kind of time period is that a lot of the sets and large shots and stuff are very CG, and they feel very CG and digital, and this definitely did not feel that way. It was dark and dirty and disgusting, and I felt diseased just watching it. Is that a good thing?
But I'd never been so happy.
But I think if you've seen any of the marketing of this movie, maybe you didn't think it was for you right off the bat. Seeing the cast may have swayed you. This thing is fucking stacked. Lily Rose Depp, Nicholas Hoult, Willem Dafoe, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and of course Bill Skarsgård playing Count Orlok in another insane role as an iconic villain. I was a little tepid on Lily Rose Depp as an actor coming into this movie, but as soon as I saw her on screen, we're given some of her first few lines, and you know this is her role. She comes out swinging. She has these fits, and her voice is so wavery and haunted. It's quite a performance that I think anybody can get behind. Nicholas Hoult is as great as ever, along with Aaron Taylor Johnson, but Willem Dafoe really grinds his teeth on this role. He plays a kooky professor that has a lot of insight into the occult and Nosferatu specifically, and I don't want to say he was chewing the scenery because it was appropriate, but it's definitely a role that I think is going to stand up there for him. Here's a fun fact I totally forgot to mention. Willem Dafoe was actually nominated for an Academy Award in 2001 for the movie Shadow of the Vampire. He plays the actor Max Schreck as Count Orlok in a fictionalized retelling of the production of the original 1922 film Nosferatu, and I love that movie. Definitely check it out. But back to Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. Holy shit, man. His presence in this movie hangs over everything like a big dark shadow. I guess that's the point. But he crushes it. His voice work specifically.
It is a black omen to journey in poor health.
Apparently, he trained a ton with voice coaches as well as singers and lowered his voice about an octave to bring this performance to life. Honestly, I wasn't sure it was his actual voice. I knew it was him physically, but I didn't know if they dubbed in his voice later because it's really jarring and I just don't see how it could have come from him, but it is deeply unnerving.
Everyone was dead. The stench of their bodies was horrible.
Another thing I expect from Robert Eggers movies is great atmosphere. I've mentioned this in my other videos, but for a horror movie to work for me, I need great atmosphere. Otherwise, it might as well just be somebody's high school stage play. It doesn't hit. Not to shit on high school stage plays, I'm just saying. But Nosferatu is incredibly dark and dreary and oppressive feeling. It takes place in kind of like the winter months in Germany, so it's extra nasty. We got snow, darkness, shadows, really uncomfortable and itchy looking clothing. It just feels awful. I can't imagine living in this time, not to mention the vampires and stuff, but you know what I mean. What I think adds to that atmosphere is the runtime. I've heard complaints about it being too long, but I think with this 2 hour and 12-minute runtime, we really get to feel this oppressive environment and live within it. And I think since we're so tuned in and engaged throughout the entire runtime, those horror bits as well as the existential horrors of this thing really hit hard. I loved it, and it didn't feel too long for me. Personally. Individual results may vary. And lastly, one of the biggest things I loved about this movie is its themes as explored through its approach to vampire lore. This is not your standard vampire fare. This harkens back to the OG lore as told by the storytellers of yore and like all of those, weird things that they were scared of. Here, Nosferatu symbolizes things like death and disease and sexual deviancy, religious deviancy, as well as a little bit of light xenophobia. How prescient. It's definitely not sexy unless you're into decaying corpses with mustaches. Niche, but I guess I get it. I think vampires are a fantastic metaphor, and this film really relishes in that metaphor and doesn't focus as much on like the literal vampire shenanigans. We do get plenty of great creepy vampire moments that I think will satisfy a lot of the creature lovers out there, but the main focus of the film is not that.
I'm ready.
I think all these elements tie together so well in such a singular vision that we get exactly what it's going for. I don't think it takes some genius film buff to dissect these things. I think any mainstream audience can watch this and know what it's going for. That's not to say everybody's gonna like this thing, but I think it's pretty easy to get behind. And speaking of disliking things, I have a few of them. They're more nitpicks than anything, but we gotta get into those.
Only you can redeem us.
I think my biggest dislike of Nosferatu 2024 is that they showed Count Orlok too much. Specifically his face. His design isn't like the OG Max Schreck version of Count Orlok from the 1922 film. It's something new, but seeing his face kind of kills some of the mystery for me, and we see it pretty early on. I think seeing the details of his face less could have upped some of the horror, and it doesn't necessarily break it for me, but it's definitely something I focused on and couldn't get past. Robert Eggers sets up some early shots of Count Orlok that are mostly in shadow that I think are going to be iconic to the Nosferatu and vampire lore going forward, but as we see his face more and more, I feel like the mystery kind of dies out as we go. It's just set up very, very well and very creepy, but once we see his face a bunch, it kind of loses that a little bit for me. To this end, and what I mentioned kind of earlier, is that Count Orlok does have a mustache. This didn't particularly bother me. I know people on TikTok are kind of talking about his mustache, but a friend of mine was very bothered by this. We were all on the group chat later talking about it, and he just kept saying mustache, mustache, mustache. Here's my honest thoughts on that. If you're in the 1830s and you're walking down the street, you see somebody rocking a face caterpillar like that, you know one thing about this guy. He Orlocks.
You could never please me as he could.
Another thing I disliked about this movie, and it's definitely a me thing, is the slurping, gulping sounds that we hear from Count Orlok as he drinks people's blood. Oh God. It like triggered my misophonia and like my tics started coming back and I thought I was gonna die. Legitimately, it was disgusting. I never want to experience that sound ever again, please. If anybody out there is working on the home release of Nosferatu, do me a favor and turn that down a little bit. I'm gonna have to mute it if I watch it again. But my final dislike of Nosferatu, and this is definitely a nitpick, is I wish there was less literal vampire moments. I do think there is a good balance because this has to satisfy a wider commercial audience, but for my money, I wish there was less of those moments and we really focused on the essence and the metaphor of the vampirism, because those for me were the strongest moments. And those also made my imagination just kind of run crazy with it. Like, it was definitely spookier in those moments, and the literal vampire sucking blood kind of things didn't hit as hard for me in the horror department. Again, that probably wouldn't work for a lot of audiences, but when we see those great shots of like the shadow of Count Orlok's hand overcoming the city and like moving through things, I love that creeping terror that the idea of Nosferatu brings to the city and our characters. It's just really haunting, and I want more. To be clear, the literal vampire stuff in this movie doesn't detract from anything. Those things, again, were gross and pretty visceral, but I wanted more metaphorical stuff in there, I guess. I don't know. But those are generally my views about the movie, and if you're new here, what I like to do is take to IMDb and see what everybody else is saying about this. The 10-star reviews, as well as the 1-star reviews.
He is coming.
Alright, currently Nosferatu has a 7.8 rating on IMDb. I think it should be higher, but we'll see where it nets out later. But let's start out with a 10 out of 10 review from the Irish Bon Scott. I recently saw the original Nosferatu for the first time. I don't think it would be possible for a modern remake to come closer to capturing that film's sense of dread than Eggers' remake. I agree with this. I love the original 1922 film, and this definitely does a fantastic job of recapturing that weird atmosphere and dread that prevails throughout the original. Eggers has obviously made a dedicated study of the original and was determined to do justice to its legacy. He masterfully manipulates the shot and the sound to construct a world where it's always night. I do have to say, in my head, this film is in black and white. There's only really a handful of shots with a lot of color in them, but it's really dark and dreary, so I think it meshes well visually with the original too. This next 10 out of 10 review is from Puff Dinny. Every artist should strive to put as much meticulous love and care into their work as Robert Eggers, a melancholy love letter to European painters of old and folklore horror history from both film and literature, packaged in a unique kind of visionary treat for the senses. It's time that the horror genre is no longer pushed aside at the Oscars and that this film is given the recognition it deserves. Wholeheartedly agree with this. This is no lazy horror film. If you see this, you will understand, without having to know anything else, that the director and people behind this movie cared so much about it, cared so much for their craft, and I think that needs to be recognized. There's been so many fantastic horror films that never really get the recognition from the Oscars. Not that that's the end-all be-all, but it'd be nice for a little appreciation here. Directing, cinematography, costume design, acting, so many elements of this movie are just at the top of their game, and I agree, should be recognized. Overall good 10 out of 10 takes. Let's see what the 1 out of 10 stars got to say about this movie. Here's a 1-star review from Scorchio14128. This was the first movie I've ever walked out of. I felt like I was watching softcore porn. Okay. Long, uncomfortable, drawn-out scenes of moaning that add absolutely nothing to the story. It was 2 hours of waiting for something to happen, ultimately being let down. There's definitely people who went into this movie expecting something completely different. I assume they're looking for a more straightforward vampire story or straightforward horror film, and got literally neither of those. I felt like I was watching a dramatic fanfiction reading while zombie Borat struggled to breathe. It wasn't even scary, just vaguely gross. Watching people wake up from a bad dream about 30 times, sweating and moaning, got boring really fast. I cannot stress how boring this movie is. There is absolutely no substance. I obviously don't agree with this take at all, but I can see as somebody going into this movie expecting something else, getting what they got was probably deeply unsatisfying. There was absolutely substance to this movie, though, so I don't know where the you were for the entire runtime. But, you know, I guess to each their own on this one. Now, our last 1-star review is from McLaughlin98589. This movie does not live up to the hype. Loud swells of music is nothing more than a jump scare. Nothing masterful or special about this film. The acting was theatrical and uninspired, and the music has been heard before. What a waste of time and money making a piece of garbage like this. I mean, it was theatrical acting, but like, that's the point. Like, this is such an elevated piece of art and cinema, and yeah, it's not going to be realistic acting. Like, we're not getting a Marriage Story levels of acting here.
You're being so much like your father.
Do not compare me to my father.
I didn't compare you to him. I said you were acting like him.
This is wild to also think it's a giant piece of garbage. I mean, come on. I didn't mention this earlier either, but I actually really like the music in this movie. I'm a huge music fan. It doesn't stand out in a way that I want to go listen to the score right away, but I think it captured the grandness and also emotional disparity within the scenes. The costumes were beautiful, but that is the only redeeming feature of this film. That was 2 hours of my life I will never get back. Of all the Dracula movies made, this is one of the worst. Hopefully the producers will be able to recoup their investment. Stay away from this stinker. Again, I'm not going to fault anybody for not liking this movie. I think it was a pretty wide release, so it's going to draw in an audience who aren't used to this director or his style necessarily, but I still think these are really bad takes from people who didn't really ingest the movie. They just wanted a more popcorn flick. You're not getting that here. I don't know how many times I have to say that. I'm just talking to myself. The real question now is, how did my cat feel about it? Taco Steve, your thoughts on Nosferatu? Well, you wanted more fish? For me, this is definitely a recommend. I love this movie. It's one of my favorite horrors of the year. It's also up there in Robert Eggers' filmography. It's not The Lighthouse, but it's also not The Northman. So if you like his work, you're gonna like this. If you're expecting something more action-packed or straightforward, this is probably not the film for you, but I will say give this thing a chance. I think it has a wider appeal and has the opportunity to turn maybe some younger audiences onto more art-leaning cinema. Ask any film dork you know, and I think they'll be able to tell you the movie where they saw it and they thought, oh, this is clicking for me. Cinema and film is art. And I think this movie could be that for somebody. Maybe I'm dreaming, and maybe people will be turned off by seeing Count Orlok's dick. I don't know. Let me know what you think of Nosferatu. Did you see it yet? Did you like it? Did you love it? Are you gonna see it? Are you excited? Do you remember the original film? Are you f***ing 120 something years old? Let me know if you can still type and haven't turned to f***ing dust yet. I obviously had a lot of opinions and I want to hear yours. But if you have made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. Make sure to subscribe and like and hit the bells and all those things. Everything helps, and I appreciate you. So until the next one, Steven.